Welcome everyone to this joint meeting of the observing and data teams. Last year, we recognized the value in having these teams meet jointly on about a quarterly basis in order to pull together what is effectively and on paper our U.S. committee in support of SAON, the International Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, and our National Committee for Arctic and Observing and Data to more effectively coordinate across these very linked issues, in particular where our representation and our partnerships and collaborations with international efforts are concerned. So today the focus is going to be very squarely on SAON, though we probably will touch on some other topics. We're first going to hear from Peter about some activities for the data committee. I'll present some information happening under the SAON board, and then we've invited HajoEicken to present a community white paper that has been developing both through this interface of the IARPC collaborations team and at various meetings and side meetings internationally over the course of the last year. Following that, we're going to have an open discussion focused on the white paper itself and getting feedback for the community behind that effort. In the course of this discussion, what we didn't leave time for is general updates from around the room. And so maybe if you could, as we get to the general discussion, open discussion session, if there's a particular update you'd like to share, especially if it is going to lead to a better discussion around the white paper, we'd love to hear that as well. I'll show more of an infographic to support what I just said when I show my slides following Peter's discussion. So Peter, please share with us your update from the Arctic Data Committee.
Sure, thank you, Sandy. I'm just going to share my screen here so that I'll a few slides. And hopefully you all can see it now. I'll go into presentation mode. So I'm going to give you a summary update. If you're interested, sorry, it's not going in, there it is. If you're interested in more details, you can go to the video of the April 25th Arctic Data Subteam meeting that you can find in the IARPC Collaborations website, and I'll post that link just after my presentation if you want to go into more detail. The Arctic Data Committee that Sandy refers to is a data committee of both the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks and IASC, and we work closely together with the Arctic Data Committee and the IARPC Arctic Data Subteam. A lot of the work that's been happening, I would say, over the past year in particular, has been culminated in a Arctic Science Ministerial deliverable statement that was created coming out of the Polar Data Planning Summit that was held in Boulder last May, and then a follow-up meeting in Davos at the Polar 2018 meeting. And this really describes a high-level overview of what we need to do as a community, which is developing an architecture, a framework, scaffolding, whatever we want to call it, for an interconnected Arctic data system. So we've had a number of activities recently to move towards that, building on activities that certainly happened before the statement. The most recent major activity was the Polar Data and Systems Architecture Workshop that was held in Geneva at the end of November in 2018. I won't go into a great deal of detail here, but if you want some detail, if you go to the link above, and I'll make this presentation available, it'll be posted on the site. You can go and find the summary report. We're working on the full report as we speak, and that should be posted in the coming weeks. Some important things that I think do relate to our discussion about the white paper is that we had a lot of discussion about this idea of the distinction between systems and infrastructure, with infrastructure being something that's sort of a fundamental layer that serves many different applications, that is community sort of maintained that evolves over time, et cetera, versus a system that's going to address a particular need, a particular set of users with specific, technical architecture, et cetera. So we use that a lot during the meeting because I think it's really important to think about that and think about the distinction between those two things and the relationships. This just gives you an idea of some of the activities that we had. We're mapping out various, what I would say here, infrastructure that we see as layers that will serve the entire community for different types of data. In this case, the Global Cryosphere Watch and the Arctic Spatial Data Infrastructure. And those are being written up, and not only in graphic form, but in descriptive form as well, and those will be in the final report. We also had a lot of discussion about moving forward as a polar data community, which again, I think is relevant to this broader discussion of how we move forward as an observing and data community. So what we all agreed on in Geneva is that we definitely want to continue this frequent national and international community collaboration. We're working on more substantial resources to support the collaboration, not just the building of systems and curation of data, et cetera, but also that glue money that sort of keeps us working together. We all recognize the value in having this broad collective vision that's medium and long term, but implementing in these smaller increments that can be managed, built, and funded in a more practical way. And then we definitely want to leverage existing successful programs so that we're not reinventing the wheel and that we recognize the urgency of getting this work done. Just lastly, in terms of community discussion, we also want to move into a culture, and I think this directly relates to the ideas that are put forward in the white paper for the observing system, is this culture where, when you're putting together a proposal, that you're considering not just the work that needs to be done individually in that proposal or specific to that proposal, but also, adding resources to help with the overall collaboration. And sorry, just last one is that we engage all the relevant actors that, in the discussion, but, not necessarily everyone is going to be involved in, all the design aspects, et cetera. It gets a bit crowded. So I think we need to have that large consultations, but then smaller groups are actually putting together and designing and moving forward. So where we want to go, the big effort right now is we're working towards a third Polar Data Forum that will happen on the 18th, the week of the 18th to 22nd of November in 2018. I'll speak about that for a couple more slides just after this one, but then we're also working on the reporting from these various recent activities. We've had them very, very frequently. So we're now going to do a combined report that will report on a number of the various meetings that we've had over the last year in particular. That will be used, it'll be broadly distributed, including also reporting at the Arctic Observing Summit in 2020 and the third Arctic Science Ministerial. And then we're constantly welcoming and cultivating new partners. Third Polar Data Forum, we're going to be holding at the FMI headquarters in Helsinki, Finland, as I said, the week of the 18th. The idea there is it'll be a two-part meeting. So the first couple of days are going to be more typical conference plenary style, where people will just be, reporting on their research, et cetera. And then 3 days of it we're aiming for would be more hackathon style, where this follows a really successful models in both Geneva and Boulder last year, where we, gave people the time to roll their sleeves up and get coding and get working on things and developing practical outcomes. So we're going to follow that. We have specific activities that are already being discussed and planned, focused particularly on federated search, semantics, and just overall data interoperability. At the moment, we've had a few planning activities. We're pushing it in terms of time, but we felt it was really important just to keep up the momentum. So we didn't want to wait, for a year and a half before having another meeting. But we have had a number of planning activities. The committees are forming, a steering committee and an organizing committee. And then we're looking, we have a website platform there, and we're just populating that and getting that ready to go. And we're hoping to have that ready for the ASSW meeting that's happening in Russia a little over about a week from now. So I think with that, I'll finish up, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Peter. So Sandy, I will pull up your slides. Give me 1 second.
Great. Any quick questions for Peter while Kelly's pulling up my slides? And Kelly, we can just jump straight to slide 2. So for those of you who are relatively new to the IARPC observing and or concept of this quarterly meeting, I did, just for reference, include a couple background slides on the U.S. Arctic Observing Network and how it's organized in order to better contextualize the role that we're playing with SAON and with U.S. partners who are interested in writing proposals to support the Arctic Observing Network and SAON itself. Are you hung up a little bit, Kelly? Is there a Is
this okay? Can you see the screen?
I see the screen. I don't see the slideshow running.
Oh, weird. Okay.
Maybe you need to enable editing.
Weird. Hold on.
Okay.
Sorry.
You may want to click resume slideshow. There's a small box there.
Yeah. There we go. Share. I was sharing the wrong screen. Okay.
Okay, gotcha. So yeah, you can jump straight ahead to the next one. So the US AON was built off the vision of the National Research Council Polar Research Board study from 2006 towards an integrated Arctic observing network, where the vision that I won't reread here was to really draw out the coordinated, the system, the sustained Earth observations, and also to zero in on the most critical components of the system. And so we know that the challenges, in particular, when it's so difficult to, in the context of science agencies, to fund coordination directly, are to support the complexity of this process in a meaningful way, move it forward in a meaningful way, and getting all the players together so that we have a well-justified system that our funding agencies can sustain. And I think if you click forward one more, it'll just indicate that US AON was created in 2016 following the first Arctic Science Ministerial as an organizational response to these challenges. So it is, we are not an entity that's supporting observations in and of themselves. We are organizationally addressing the challenges that were identified in order to move the observing system forward. On the next slide, which is a lot to absorb, but zeroing in on the green box just shows where US AON is positioned. And as I mentioned earlier, part of the reason why we meet jointly with the data team in support of some of these large international efforts. We are part of IARPC. There's a federal funders board that sits as a sub-body of the IARPC staff group, but the rest of us meet as we do today through the observing sub-team and the data sub-team and interact with the different teams within IARPC collaborations, but also to create a more unified interface for partners like the Group on Earth Observations, Global Cryosphere Watch, some of the partners that Peter mentioned, and then also, importantly, SAON. And then on the next slide, specifically, a key activity that we've been trying to promote and support under SAON in partnership with the other large entities that contribute to SAON and the other national partners is to develop a roadmap or what we are calling a roadmap for Arctic observing, which was identified in SAON's strategic plan last year as a critical tool that we need in order to collectively assess and understand the most urgent and important aspects of the observing system, and to create better capacity for coordination across all of these different players, and quite literally get them interacting on the same map. So this is a key initiative under SAON right now, and it is urgently in need of support through funded efforts and voluntary efforts to move it forward. On the next slide, I'll show you the path that we are currently walking down from the standpoint of SAON and moving this forward. So starting in the lower left-hand side, these are the 3 goals, or I'm sorry, not starting on the lower left-hand side. What's outlined here are the 3 goals of SAON's strategic plan: create the roadmap, which relates to its Committee on Networks; promote free and ethically open access to data, which relates to the committee Peter was just speaking about, the Arctic Data Committee; and then goal 3 is assuring the sustainability of Arctic observing, which is a group which is especially organized around the national funding partners, the entities that have the budgets and the capability to fund and sustain an observing network, provided that they get strong and compelling rationale and guidance and well-coordinated plans from the community. And so what was recognized last year at a meeting that was held on this was that SAON needed to improve its definition of what that task force, or of what that roadmap would include. In response to that recommendation, SAON created a roadmap task force that's active now, and will be active, very active for the next 6 months, in order to create a stronger definition of what it means by a roadmap, to very much engage with those funding entities across all of the different countries that participate in the SAON process, to provide criteria and guidance for how assessments should be conducted, and basically just to create sort of a meta structure that can guide proposal-driven activities, so that when groups come forward and want to support this process, there's been an internationally agreed upon set of parameters of how the process will proceed. And so this is ongoing work right now. We expect to have the definition process to a draft by the end of the summer for further input. It will include things like how we see societal benefit areas being used under the roadmap. It will include information about how we see alignment and engagement with global partners, and how we see alignment, collaboration, and engagement with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities, those types of very high-level kind of principles. And so on the last slide, it's just some links for where you can go for more information. Oh, I'm sorry, we can skip over this one because I think it'll come up later in Hajo's presentation. This is where you can go for more information about AON. Molly McCammon and AUS host a website for us at the following link. And I will leave it at that. So if we can field questions on these 2 introductory pieces, or it might be more strategic to drop straight into Hajo's presentation, because I think Peter and I were really just trying to set some context from the SAON level for what Hajo was presenting today.
Sounds good. So Hajo, at the bottom of your screen, there you go. You got it.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to this group. I'd like to just give you a brief overview of this white paper that a number of us have been working on for some time. Several of the co-authors are on the call. I saw Sandy, Hank Loescher, Will Ambrose, Peter Pulsifer. And we're very much interested in getting your feedback, either directly via email to either Sandy or myself, or in the Q&A afterwards, or in any other form. I suspect I may run into some of you over at Arctic Science Summit Week as well, which is a good opportunity to delve in more depth. The motivation for this, Sandy already nicely laid out. This is a part of a process that we see tying into the broader Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks initiative, SAON. A lot of us worked together as part of the last Arctic Observing Summit, and some follow-up work, in particular with the working group on observing system design implementation. And the white paper that you've gotten access to, that's still in a draft version, so I'd like you to keep that in mind, is a way to help channel some of these efforts into a set of activities and a framework that we hope supports US AON, as Sandy laid out, but then also brings together a number of the international partners and thereby provides specific support action for SAON as a whole. So just a brief reminder, I mean, Sandy already captured some of this, but it's, you know, and I of course, I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think we should all recognize with relief and warmth and gratitude that the fact that sustained Arctic observations provide shared benefits to Arctic and non-Arctic countries is now widely recognized. I mean, the fact that it does matter how and where non-Arctic countries make observations, sustained observations in the Arctic, has an impact on economic activities, hazard mitigation, and a range of other activities in these non-Arctic countries is a major motivation for non-Arctic nations to engage in Arctic observations. The other thing that's recognized as well in the Arctic, despite sort of the ups and downs and short-term boom and busts of national or international policy frameworks or politics frameworks, is the fact that we need collaborative approaches to sustained observations, and we have to have processes and capacity in place to allow different types of efforts to converge towards a common observing framework. As I'll point out in a minute, and again, a lot of you have worked on this yourselves for a long time, you know, we won't be getting the all new shiny 2021 blueprint-derived Arctic observing system from the ground up. It's going to have to be something that is put together out of pre-existing or newly fashioned parts. So that gets us to the point where I think it's also important to recognize, and it was very interesting as a member of the US Science Delegation to the last Arctic Science Ministerial, the fact that you had over 30 countries who recognized the fact that SAON has emerged as the de facto governance body under IASC, so including non-Arctic countries and the Arctic Council, to provide an inclusive environment within which you might be able to develop a framework for coordinated collaborative observations. That's a really important step that's been taken, and the vision that SAON laid out, you know, through the scientific community, agencies, indigenous peoples in the Arctic, a whole range of other organizations, the vision for a connected, collaborative, and comprehensive long-term pan-Arctic observing system that serves societal needs, again, is something that people see a need to support. So the question then is, well, how do we move from that vision and this broader recognition to specific action? You know, this is a slide of Sandy's. What we all recognize is there's a lot of Arctic observing going on, you know, both at the regional, local level, global programs or projects. A lot of progress has been made. You have the Arctic Observing Viewer team who's tracking a lot of this, but ultimately it's still a patchwork of activities, and integration so far has mostly focused on disciplinary or sectoral areas, or very, very focused regional or local areas where integration is possibly a bit more straightforward. But really what we're aiming for here is, and I want to acknowledge the observing system engineering design hard-nosed perspective that Hank Loescher and the NEON team have been providing in this conversation. What's needed is some type of process that starts to bring all of these different activities into a common framework that allows us to actually draw and derive shared benefits from shared observing system components. That's the challenge. How do you do that? SAON has laid out through the 3 sets of goals that Sandy showed in a previous slide, has laid out a pathway, and essentially what the white paper that we've been discussing here and sharing with you is trying to lay out is how do we actually get to move down that pathway, the white paper being focused in particular on the US contribution, but clearly in an international framework, ideally parsing things so that we internationally best coordinate and make use of shared resources here. So moving from the broader scale assessment that SAON has already been working on under the Committee of Observations and Networks. The Arctic Data Committee has also contributed to this quite a bit. Moving from that to the actual Arctic Observing Roadmap that gives everybody who's interested in Arctic observing clear sense of direction of how they can best contribute. And it's important to keep in mind that simply bundling efforts is not going to work. We have to have a coherent set of observations, and they have to draw on frameworks, protocols, requirements that ultimately are guided by shared benefits. And in doing that, we ultimately need some type of overarching common thematic framework. You've seen this slide before. Sandy laid this out. So this is where SAON is currently at in terms of the 3 goals that they've identified. And under these goals, a set of different objectives. And the white paper that we're presenting here for discussion is essentially trying to help meet some of these objectives, again, through the US perspective. But as I'll show here in a minute, because of our location, because of the location of the US Arctic and the Pacific Arctic sector, we feel that whatever resources, thoughts, and activities we concentrate into that region will have much broader internationally relevant benefits. So in terms of what's needed, if you look at the SAON strategy, if you look at the priorities identified at the last Arctic Science Ministerial meeting, if you look at the call to action and the report from the Arctic Observing Summit last year, it's recognized there's a need for an assessment of the current capabilities for observations, linking those clearly to associated benefits, and identifying major gaps. And then the roadmap that we've already discussed that clearly lays out a path that can be followed by individual contributors to an integrated system of systems. And these may be individual contributors, small-scale projects, maybe large-scale national, international programs, maybe individual institutes, national institutes for polar research, say, a whole range of other actors that are important here. But beyond that, we also need we want to get this underway, so this isn't just about coordination. The white paper tries to lay out a path of how we can take specific steps that actually get both existing observing projects, channel their observations into a common or shared benefits framework, and then in the process identify gaps that then get filled by new observations in those areas where needed. So how do we do that? That's where the networking and the types of activities that are laid out in the white paper come in. And essentially, what the three elements of these activities and structures that we're proposing here can be boiled down to elements of coordination, and this is largely through existing frameworks, in particular using the Arctic Observing Summit as a jumping off point and turning that more into a process that's fully integrated into SAON. Design development, so actually coming up with a specific observing system design that recognizes the fact that you're building this out of, in part, pre-existing components, in part new components. And finally, information infrastructure. A lot of what Peter Pulsifer just presented on is already making significant progress here. With regards to information infrastructure, really what's lacking, arguably, is a specific use case where these frameworks that Peter shared with you can be applied in a confined, tractable setting. And based on deliberations at the past few Arctic Observing Summits in particular and other activities, we feel that a focus on food security would give us a good opportunity to get to this point of working on something very specific. So what you see here on the right-hand side is sort of a more layered representation of the different elements of how you go from these broader scale societal benefit areas, key science questions that have already been well laid out. You get into the coordination realm as you think about more focused research questions and use cases. That takes you down into the layers where you're starting to look more specifically at what type of information is needed, what type of, say, accuracy, precision, what type of data products, what specific essential variables, and then that gets you down into the details of actual technical and design requirements and the actual system design and the related information infrastructure around that. So what we're proposing is essentially combining a set of activities that include these three elements. Here's another way to represent it. This is a graphic from the white paper. In the interest of time, I don't want to spend too much time going through this, but we have in mind a series of activities, coordination, mostly by transforming the Arctic Observing Summit from a biennial meeting into an actual process with very specific sustained working group activities. Those types of coordination activities would then feed into a design development intensive set of activities that focus on food security and coastal marine environments in the Pacific Arctic sector, so US Arctic focused in particular. And these activities here are in some ways where it gets interesting from a research perspective as well, because the team that's put the white paper together represents the indigenous peoples and coastal community perspective on food security. We're drawing in particular from Inuit Circumpolar Council's food security report from a couple of years ago. It draws on the process of identifying essential variables through the Global Ocean Observing System framework, for example. It draws on the greater level of maturity reached within the quantitative observing network design community, in particular using optimization approaches, observing system simulation experiments, and it draws on the expertise at the technical implementation level, if you will, that's represented by efforts such as NEON. So that'll be interesting work in this box here. But once over the course of the next several years, as we envision this gets translated into data being assembled, staged, made available, again, with the help of NSF's Arctic Data Center, ADC. Matt Jones is part of these efforts as well. We then would also start to look more carefully at how the information that's being generated by the system is actually meeting the needs and issues that were originally identified by, for example, the food security framework documents and concerns by resource managers, coastal communities, indigenous people. And ideally, over the course of the time period that we envision here over 5 years, encompassing 3 sets of Arctic Observing Summits, we see this as an iterative process to help sort of see an evolution of the landscape of observing assets in the particular area. Here's another way to think about this in terms of the essential variables concept, where you're actually starting to talk very specifically about variables that relate to food security, whether it's sea ice concentration, wave height, both of them related more to access, fish abundance, price of gasoline, what have you, and the types of observing requirements that go with those. So in some ways, we're seeing this process of moving from the coordination through the design development tasks to generation of actual data products. And with that, I leave it up for questions, or for that matter, if any of the other white paper co-authors on the call want to add anything, that would be a great opportunity as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hajo. Are there any questions?
If you don't have questions, I have another figure for you that I can share.
So, Hajo, this is Molly. I have a question.
Yes.
Before you go back. Could you go back to the one slide at the beginning? Yeah, you went past it. Keep going back, one more, I think. There, this one.
Oh.
So have you thought, because when we're working with the operational management agencies and looking at observations and needs, and I think I've shown a slide before where our focus is more starting with what are the decisions that society and that the various stakeholder and groups need to make. So rather than starting with the science questions and the research questions, it's more a focus of what decisions need to be made and what kind of information products decision. And then from that, you identify the needed information and the science requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So have you thought about trying to, how to broaden this from this has a very research focus on it, which I know AON and SAON is, but to broaden it more to incorporate more of the operational agencies and more of the management and stakeholder groups? Have you thought about kind of expanding that kind of approach a little bit?
Yeah, and I just didn't do the breadth justice. I think that has been part of the conversation. To give you a specific example, if you look at food security, I mean, that would include collecting data that are relevant in a regulatory or marine resources management context, right? So it might include the question as to, again, I'm not a food security expert as such, yeah. But you could say, for example, with walrus, right? It's very difficult to count the number of walrus, but it's clear that with the changes we're seeing in the Bering Sea, there are major transitions happening with respect to the health and distribution of the walrus population. You have a co-management board that's meant to manage those. And what you've seen in terms of food security in recent years is that it's mostly the access question that's limiting people in coastal communities in Alaska from bringing in a sufficient harvest. And so that puts a lot of pressure on a small part of the walrus population at a very brief time of year. And so you could ask yourself, what are the variables in terms of physical oceanography, sea ice, or the health of walrus, or the age or population structure of the walrus population that relate to sustainable harvests during these short periods of time, So I would see those types of questions informing the types of measurements or variables that need to be derived. And I would definitely see the co-management board, the regulatory agency, representatives from coastal communities be part of the conversation. So the idea is that this would, by working with a broader range of stakeholders and agencies, would bring these different groups to the table to hash out, how do you go from the fairly broad sort of guidance that the ICC's food security report provides, or from the much more researchy, as you put it, types of data that, for example, the Distributed Biological Observatory provides. How do you go from those to the types of data or information products that agencies need to make decisions?
Yeah, I just think it's important to recognize that not all of those information needs and decision support tools that are needed are necessarily hypothesis-based.
Yes.
And that needs to be built into the system. So instead of looking at the information products after you've kind of done the research, it's having that drive it at the very top.
If I could chime in on that point, I think that maybe the diagram could use some tweaking around this language of grand challenge science questions and focused research questions, because I think one thing that's reflected in the white paper is that the ability to use something like the SAON STIPI societal benefit structure as a constraint on an assessment of what the most impactful observations are going to be, in addition to using these other tools like the observing system experiments and the kind of network of expertise through the food security network, is that you can begin to identify at that, as you say, not necessarily at a hypothesis-driven point, but at a high level where there's commonality, common uses for an observation that, and so in the societal benefit structure, there's 11 societal benefit areas that relate much more to management decisions, operational uses, and one societal benefit area that relates to fundamental understanding. And so I think one hope is that in using that as a constraint in this process at the onset, we'll be able to identify some of those more requirements-driven needs that overlap with the research-driven needs.
Yeah, good point. Thanks.
Bill Manley?
Hi, so I have a question about the white paper and how it relates to the different phases of the roadmap. Could you go back, I think it was towards the beginning or towards the end of, the 3 different steps? Yeah. So where does the white paper fit into this? It's not the roadmap. It's kind of like a start to how to get to the roadmap?
No, I mean, the process laid out in the white paper would contribute significantly, working with SAON in laying out the roadmap. Right now, what's underway is a process to just provide a better definition of what is a roadmap. I mean, you hear this a lot, and so it's got to be made clear. Okay, what are we actually talking about if we talk about a roadmap? That's underway under SAON, and Sandy and Yen Renee can say more about that. But assuming that's going to be completed by the time the next Observing Summit comes around, late March next year, the plan is that this group, or the process laid out here, would actually start to work on being much more specific in terms of what are elements of a roadmap. So as an example, I still see the creating a process by which a combination of expert knowledge, from indigenous experts or local experts, agency personnel, and quantitative network design approaches can converge towards a practical approach as to how different observing resources are deployed and data are generated. That would be an important step of that roadmap. And we're not going to solve it for, assuming this were to go forward, we would use the example of food security in coastal marine environments to help work through some of the steps that are part of that process, and ideally or hopefully be able to demonstrate, well, here's how this can be done so that others can essentially benefit from that approach, or even if worthwhile, SAON or one of the SAON committees might create a working group that does this in a more sort of generic pan-Arctic fashion.
Great. Yeah, I think all this is incredibly important and needed. And so it sounds like the white paper is a SAON document or a US SAON contribution to SAON that is a step along the road.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it.
Great, thank you.
So, Hajo, Renee Tezusco asks, have the members been identified for the AOS task teams, the roadmap task force?
Well, that's where the nomenclature comes in. So right now, SAON has a roadmap definition team, and Sandy can speak more to that. That group has been identified, and they've started working on just defining, okay, what does a roadmap have to be, or what does a roadmap have to provide in the way of services or outcomes. The roadmap task force as such, members haven't been identified. Is that a good way to put it, Sandy? Yan?
Actually, so the roadmap task force is a body operating under SAON right now, and there's a small definition drafting team. This AOS, if you look under goal 1, the AOS task team on optimization and implementation, that's a little bit closer to the body that I think represents what the white paper is really speaking to. But there's some overlap. So this task team on optimization and implementation basically grew out of a working group from the Arctic Observing Summit in Polar 2018 and has been meeting under the Committee on Networks. But I think at the point where the white paper kind of gets ratified and endorsed and moved forward, there would be a more of a recruitment process for drawing in the larger community to that.
Yeah, so maybe, okay, good. Thanks for clarifying. So I think what needs to be made clear is that the Arctic Observing Summit is a bottom-up activity. So there's always ways for anybody who's interested in being part of the process to engage at the working group level for the Arctic Observing Summit, either as just a member, informal or formal, or as part of the co-leadership of these working groups. And these working groups, as the whole Arctic Observing Summit gets restructured, which will begin with the next one, and then evolve if this all goes forward over the next 1 or 2 subsequent summits, there would be a much tighter link between SAON, the Roadmap Task Force, the Committee on Observations and Networks, the Arctic Data Committee, and again, all of those are very much open. We'd like to see as much involvement as there's interest.
Awesome. In the interest of time, I'd like to open it up to the Data Committee. If you guys have any comments or questions about how to relate these efforts to data, that'd be great. Oh, Bill, I see you've raised your hand.
I didn't lower mine, but I have a comment. Within the Arctic data community and the global data community, within the IARPIC team and the SAON committee, I think it's broad consensus that data become more fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that is like it's an important guiding principle, I think, for this roadmap and for SAON, right? In terms of the data being available for integration and synthesis to address some of these societal needs, et cetera. Beyond that, I think it would be important to make some progress that different networks share information about their networks, not just the data, but about what the networks are, what they're doing, where, when, and in terms of observations. That is, that information about networks is also findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, fair. So in terms of strategic assessment, say, there are some steps that could be made to provide a broader perspective of what actually is happening, and then help to better identify gaps and directions and clarify goals.
Okay. Jonathan?
Hi, this is Jonathan Blythe. Once again, I'm BOEM and data sub-team co-lead. And, you know, this is, I'm digesting this, being relatively new to this, this activity. And one thing I wanted to mention is the, there is, from the data management perspective, there's a lot of benefit payback to integrating into this kind of framework where you're tying to specific societal goals or whatever. Because from an outreach perspective, you might have a public audience that doesn't really know or interact with the science data, the earth science data, very much on a day-to-day basis, but they will recognize the societal benefit. So what we want to be careful of is that those societal benefits are, in the way they're defined, are you know, relevant to the coastal communities and that we're working with, and they understand what those mean. And they're not defined with, you know, very highbrow, you know, theoretical kind of constraints. So making it really pragmatic at that level would just be my advice, and that'll give us a way, from a data management perspective, to bring a lot more relevance to our day-to-day work.
Yeah, I will send out the link to the societal benefit areas so you can see them.
I beat you to it, Kelly.
Good job, Sandy. Thanks.
For those who haven't seen the report before, where the Arctic societal benefits are presented and identified, it's in the link, and you can learn more about the process. It was as inclusive a process was followed as possible, but there's always, of course, limitations to those. But Jonathan, I think your comments are spot on, that we always need to hold things to that standard of relevance, and really ratify that we're on track and not leaving people behind.
So Kelly, this is Peter. I may just quickly say, knowing we're coming on time, that I think the developments we've had, you know, in the data community in recent years has positioned us well to continue to engage in this process. We're making progress, and you know, we're poised to do the types of things that Hajo has described in terms of use cases, et cetera. In keeping with what Jonathan said, and both Bill as well, is, you know, we're working on mapping out the system to understand, you know, who has what where. And we know that we actually have a lot. We have a lot of infrastructure in place, a lot of data in place, but really it's about understanding, you know, the requirements and the knowledge constructs, so the concepts and the categories of data that people need, and then tagging the systems with that so that we can do what Bill's talking about, find it, access it, and so on. So in a lot of ways, the lift is probably not as big as we think it might be. In some ways, it's superimposing those needs and those requirements on top of a lot of existing infrastructure. So in a way, it's sitting there idling, waiting to be useful, but we need those types of things Jonathan said, not just for communities, but I also think for research, for operations, for policy, and so on, to be able to mediate those data and make them useful.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Peter. So in the interest of time, I'm going to invite all of you to continue the conversation on the IARPIC Collaborations website. You can chat back and forth in the comments. We would really love to see that. As just kind of a quick last announcement, so many of you know that Peter is going to be stepping down as co-lead for the data team. So there is an announcement out on the IARPIC Collaborations website. We're looking for a new team lead. So I'm going to post that in the chat right now. So if you're interested, please let us know, and we'd love to have you on board.
So just to be clear, Kelly, to people, that's I'm stepping down from the IARPIC Arctic Data Subteam lead. I will remain as the International Arctic Data Committee lead.
Yes.
That's been approved by my new institution. So.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for a great meeting.